Welcome to Wild Cowboy Tales. Come sit a spell and listen. This ain't a story about famous gunslingers or legendary lawmen. This is a tale about a quiet valley, a place so peaceful it forgot the world outside was filled with wolves. And it's the story of a woman who, when the wolves came and burned her world to the ground, remembered she was born with teeth. This is the story of Rachel Miles, and the fire she became. Ash Hollow was a secret the territory kept from itself. Tucked between the granite teeth of the Black Spur Mountains and the winding green ribbon of the Clear Creek, it was a valley that had been blessed by a gentler hand. While the lands beyond were scorched brown and scoured by a relentless wind, the hollow was a patch of impossible green, its soil dark and rich, its air sweet with the scent of wild plum and damp earth. For generations, the families of Ash Hollow had lived a quiet, insulated life. The chaos of the post-war territories a distant rumor, like thunder from a storm 100 miles away. Rachel Miles was a product of that peace. Or so it seemed. A young widow, she lived on a small farm at the northern edge of the valley, a place she and her husband, David, had built with their own hands. The house was modest, the barn sturdy, the fields a testament to their shared labor. A year had passed since David had been taken by a fever, a swift, merciless illness that had left a silence in the house that no amount of work could fill. To the people of the small town of Haven, which was the heart of the hollow, Rachel was an object of gentle pity. They saw her slight frame, her quiet demeanor, her sad, gray eyes. They saw a woman tending her husband's grave with the same gentle care she gave her crops. They called her poor Rachel, a woman destined to a lonely life, a pale flower wilting in the shadow of her grief. They did not see the way her hands were never truly still, her fingers always indexing the world around her. They did not notice that her quietness was not one of submission, but of observation. And they certainly did not know about the man who had raised her, a man whose name was spoken in fearful whispers in saloons from the border to the plains, Silas the Gray Man Kane, a bounty hunter whose skill at tracking was legendary, and whose lessons to his only daughter had been in the brutal arts of survival. Sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, a memory would surface. Her, a girl of 12, her hands raw from the cold. Her father's voice, rough as gravel. The world is full of wolves, girl. They come in all shapes. A man with a smile, a man with a badge, a man with a Bible. Don't ever forget how to be a wolf yourself. A wolf watches. A wolf waits. And a wolf never, ever gives up its ground. She had buried that girl, that wolf, when she met David. He was a good, kind man, a farmer who saw the world as something to be nurtured, not conquered. In his love, she had found a peace she never knew existed. She had become Rachel Miles, farmer's wife. She had learned the language of seasons and soil, and had willingly forgotten the language of the trap, the knife, and the gun. The peace of Ash Hollow, and the peace in Rachel's heart, was shattered on a hot, late summer afternoon. They came from the east, a plague of dust and noise that poured through the mountain pass like a dirty flood. There were 30 of them, a disciplined, organized gang of outlaws who called themselves the Red Hand Brigade, led by a man named Colonel Ezra Thorne. Thorne was not a common bandit. He was a disgraced ex-cavalry officer, a man who saw the lawless West not as a place to hide, but as a kingdom to be conquered. He had the tactical mind of a soldier and the conscience of a scorpion. They hit the outlying farms first. It was not random banditry. It was a systematic campaign of terror. They didn't just steal, they burned. They didn't just intimidate, they killed. A farmer who refused to give up his grain was shot in his own field. A family that tried to flee was ridden down for sport. Word of the atrocities spread through the valley like a poison, carried by terrified, smoke-stained survivors. Haven, the town that had never even needed a proper jail, was paralyzed with a fear it had never known. The town council met, but their talk was of appeasement, of supplication. The sheriff, an old man who had spent his career breaking up fistfights and finding lost livestock, was utterly out of his depth. The wolves had come to the sheepfold, and the shepherd had no idea what to do. Rachel, on her farm, heard the news and felt a cold, familiar dread. It was the feeling she had been taught to recognize as a child, the feeling of the hunter when he realizes he is now the hunted. She barricaded her door, brought the livestock into the barn, and sat through the night in the dark, the old Winchester rifle that had been David's resting across her lap. It felt clumsy and foreign in her hands, a tool of his world, not hers. The Red Hand Brigade reached her farm the next morning. She watched from a window as 5 of them rode into her yard. They didn't approach the house. They moved with a chilling, professional purpose. One man went to the barn, another to the chicken coop. They carried torches. The man who seemed to be their leader, a lieutenant with a nasty, scarred face, dismounted and walked to her front porch. "The colonel sends his regards," he shouted, his voice thick with mockery. "He's requisitioning this valley. All property is now the property of the brigade. You have until sundown to vacate. Anything left behind will be considered a donation." Rachel stood behind her door, her heart hammering. She thought of David, of the life they had built. This was her home, her sanctuary, her last connection to him. "This is my land," she called out, her voice trembling but clear. "It's not yours to take." The man on the porch laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Brave words, widow," he sneered. He gave a signal. The man at the barn threw his torch onto the dry roof of the hayloft. It caught instantly, a whoosh of orange flame erupting against the blue sky. Another torch arced through there and landed on the roof of her small house. They didn't wait to see it burn. They laughed, mounted their horses, and rode away, leaving her to her fate. Rachel stared, frozen, as the flames began to lick at the edges of the roof. She saw the smoke pouring from the barn where her animals were trapped. She saw the fire consuming the home that held all her memories of David. She saw the life she had so carefully, so lovingly built, turning to ash. And in that moment, something inside her broke. But it was not her spirit. It was the dam she had built to hold back the past. The grief, the fear, the sorrow, they were all consumed by a sudden, white-hot surge of pure, elemental rage. The fire outside was nothing compared to the inferno that had just been ignited within her. The farmer's wife died in that fire, but the bounty hunter's daughter was reborn. The smoke was a fist in her throat, the heat a physical blow. For a moment, Rachel was paralyzed, watching the flames devour her life. The terrified bellows of the cow trapped in the barn and the high-pitched screams of the chickens in their burning coop snapped her from her trance. Her rage, for a brief, crystalline moment, was focused not on vengeance, but on rescue. She burst from the house, grabbing a bucket from the porch. The well was her only hope. She worked the pump handle with a frantic, desperate energy, her muscles straining. She threw bucket after bucket of water onto the flames licking at the house, a futile, pathetic gesture against the growing inferno. The roof was catching, the dry shingles curling and blackening. It was already too late for the house. A wave of despair washed over her, so profound it nearly brought her to her knees. David's house. Our house. But the agonized lowing from the barn cut through her grief. She dropped the bucket and ran for the barn. The main doors were already wreathed in flame. The side door, the one leading to the milking stall, was her only chance. She covered her face with her sleeve and plunged into the choking, blinding smoke. The heat was immense. The air was a toxic soup of burning hay and wood. Her milk cow, Bessie, was wild-eyed with terror, crashing against the sides of her stall. Rachel fumbled with the latch, her fingers clumsy from the heat and panic. The wood was hot to the touch. She finally got it open and slapped the cow's flank, driving the terrified animal out the door into the relative safety of the pasture. She managed to kick open the door to the chicken coop, and a frantic, feathered torrent of birds exploded into the open air. She stumbled out of the barn just as a section of the hayloft roof collapsed inward with a deafening roar, sending a geyser of sparks and embers into the sky. She fell to her knees, coughing, her lungs on fire, her face smeared with soot. She had saved the animals, a small, hollow victory. She turned and looked at her home. It was now a funeral pyre. The roof was gone, the walls were skeletal fingers of flame reaching for the sky. Everything was gone. The bed she had shared with David, the table where they had eaten their meals, the small, carved bird he had given her for their first anniversary. All of it, turning to ash. She stayed there, kneeling in the dirt, long after the last of the brigade had disappeared. She watched until the flames died down, until the barn and the house were just two smoldering, blackened skeletons against the afternoon sky. The townspeople, seeing the smoke, had not come. They were too afraid. She was utterly, completely alone. The sun began to set, casting long, mournful shadows across the ruin of her life. The rage that had surged within her had cooled, not into embers, but into something harder and more dangerous, a core of ice-cold, diamond-hard resolve. She was no longer crying. Her tears had been boiled away by the fire. When the last of the light had faded, she stood up. Her movements were stiff, her body aching, but there was a new purpose in her stride. She walked not towards the ruins, but towards the small, stone-walled root cellar, whose heavy oak door, set into the side of a small hillock, had been untouched by the fire. This was where she and David had stored their winter preserves, their potatoes and apples. But it held another, older secret. In the far corner, behind a stack of empty crates, was a section of the stone wall that looked no different from the rest. But Rachel knew which stone to press. A section of the wall swung inward on silent, well-oiled hinges, revealing a dark, narrow space. The air that wafted out was cool and smelled of gun oil, leather, and time. This was her father's legacy, a cache he had insisted she prepare when she and David first settled the farm. "A wolf always has a bolt hole, girl," he had grumbled. "And a bolt hole always has its teeth." She had thought him a paranoid old man. Now, she understood. She lit a lantern. The light revealed the contents of the cache. Hanging on wooden pegs was a set of buckskin clothing, tough and practical, dyed a mottled brown and gray for camouflage. There was a coiled rope, a hunter's skinning knife, and a Sharp's rifle, a newer model than Jacob's, its long, octagonal barrel a gleaming, deadly blue-black. Leaning next to it was a shotgun with a brutally short barrel. On a shelf sat several heavy canvas belts, one looped for rifle cartridges, another with two holsters holding a matched pair of Colt revolvers, their ivory grips smooth and cool to the touch. There were boxes of ammunition, carefully sealed in wax paper, and at the back, a small, locked metal box. Rachel knew the combination. Her birthdate. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, was a set of throwing knives, perfectly balanced, and a garrote. And beneath that, a small, leather-bound book. She opened it. It was her father's ledger. Page after page of names, locations, and bounties collected, all written in his tight, precise script. It was a textbook of his trade, a chronicle of a life spent hunting men. She ran her fingers over the cold steel of the Colts. She remembered the weight of them, the endless hours her father had made her practice, drawing, aiming, firing, until the movements were as natural as breathing. She had hated it then. She had yearned for a life of peace, of gentleness. She had chosen David's world, and the wolves had come and burned that world down. She stripped off her soot-stained dress, the last remnant of the farmer's wife, and let it fall to the dirt floor. She dressed herself in the buckskins. They fit perfectly. They felt like a second skin, a skin she had forgotten she owned. She strapped on the gun belt, the weight of the twin Colts a familiar, solid presence on her hips. She slung the shotgun over one shoulder and picked up the Sharps. It was heavier than David's Winchester, a more serious, specialized tool. A tool for killing at a distance. She looked at her reflection in a shard of broken mirror she found on the floor. The woman looking back was a stranger. The soft lines of her face were gone, replaced by hard angles of soot and resolve. Her eyes, once a gentle gray, were now the color of a storm cloud, and in their depths, a fire burned. She was no longer Rachel Miles, the grieving widow. She was Silas Kane's daughter again. She was the wolf he had raised her to be. The Red Hand Brigade had burned down her farm. She would burn down their world, one man at a time. The moon was a cold, silver sliver in the sky, offering little light. It was a hunter's moon, and Rachel moved through the darkness with a predator's grace. She did not seek the main roads. She moved through the high country, through the dense stands of pine and the rocky defiles that bordered the valley, terrain she knew as well as the lines on her own hand. The buckskins blended into the shadows, and her soft-soled moccasins made no sound on the pine needles and rock. Her grief was a stone in her gut, a cold, heavy weight. But her rage was a fire that fueled her, keeping the cold and the exhaustion at bay. Her mind, once filled with the gentle rhythms of the farm, was now a cold, clear instrument of calculation. She was processing information, assessing threats, planning her attack. It was as if a dormant part of her brain had awakened, a part that thought in terms of sight lines, wind direction, and killing zones. She knew she couldn't attack the brigade's main camp. Thorne was a soldier. His camp would be well guarded. A direct assault was suicide. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. Never fight a wolf pack head-on, girl. You pick off the stragglers. You make the pack nervous. A nervous wolf is a stupid wolf. She needed a straggler. Her first target. From her vantage point in the hills, she had watched the brigade's movements for 2 days after the fire. They were arrogant, confident in their numbers, and the terror they had inspired. They sent out regular patrols, small groups of 3 or 4 men, to scout the valley and to continue their campaign of intimidation. One patrol in particular caught her attention. They had a predictable route, how long, looping right along the western edge of the valley, culminating in a stop at a natural spring to water their horses. The spring was located in a small, box canyon, a natural trap. She spent a day preparing. She did not plan a simple ambush. A simple ambush was about killing. She needed to do more than that. She needed to sow terror. She needed to make them understand that the valley itself had turned against them. She went to the box canyon. Using her knife, she cut lengths of sturdy vine. She climbed the steep canyon walls, her fingers and toes finding purchase in the rock, and rigged a deadfall, a large, partially loose boulder. Held in place by a network of vines connected to a single tripwire she strung across the narrow entrance to the canyon. It was a crude trap, but it would be effective. Next, she prepared her killing ground. About 100 yards from the canyon entrance, and a thicket of dense scrub oak that overlooked the trail, she built a small, concealed blind. She didn't just hide in the bushes, she wove branches together, creating a small, natural-looking screen that broke up her outline and concealed her movements. On the third day, she was in position before dawn. The Sharp's rifle rested on a bipod she had fashioned from two sturdy sticks. She was utterly still, her breathing slow and even. She was no longer a person, she was a part of the landscape, an extension of the patient, waiting earth. Around mid-morning, she heard them. 3 riders, laughing and talking, their voices carrying in the clear, still air. They were careless, utterly oblivious. They rode directly towards the canyon entrance. The lead rider's horse tripped the wire. For a split second, nothing happened. Then, with a deep, grinding groan, the boulder at the top of the canyon wall shifted. The vine snapped. The massive rock fell, not onto the riders, but onto the trail directly behind them, sealing the canyon entrance with a deafening crash that sent a plume of dust into the air. The 3 men's horses reared in terror. The men, their faces masks of shocked disbelief, spun around to see their path blocked by a solid wall of rock. They were trapped. Panic set in. They drew their pistols, looking around wildly, trying to understand what had just happened. From her blind, Rachel watched, her face impassive. Now, the lesson began. She lined up her sights on the man to the far right. He was trying to calm his horse, his back partially to her. She aimed not for his chest, but for the pistol in his hand. Show them they are helpless, her father's voice whispered. She squeezed the trigger. The roar of the Sharps was like a thunderclap. The man screamed, not in pain, but in shock, as his pistol was violently torn from his grasp, the metal shattering, his hand numb and tingling. Before the other 2 could react, she worked the rifle's action with a fluid, practiced motion. She acquired her second target, the middle rider, who was raising his own gun. She aimed for his rifle, which was still in its scabbard on his saddle. The heavy slug struck the saddle, splintering the wooden frame and tearing the rifle away, sending it flying into the dust. The man's horse, terrified, bolted, throwing him to the ground. 2 of them were disarmed in the space of 5 seconds. The third man, the one whose pistol she had shot from his hand, stared at his numb fingers in horror. He looked up at the silent, watching canyon walls, his face pale with a dawning, superstitious dread. They were being toyed with. The man on the ground scrambled to his feet and made a run for his fallen rifle. "I wouldn't," a voice called out, calm and clear, seemingly coming from the rocks all around them. It was Rachel's voice, but it was different. It held none of its former softness. It was as cold and sharp as a shard of ice. The man froze. All 3 of them stood perfectly still, like statues, their eyes scanning the rocks, their faces slick with sweat. "You burned my home," the voice continued. "You killed my animals. You thought you were burning a helpless widow." A flicker of recognition, of terrible understanding, dawned on the face of the first man. "The Harlow woman," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "The widow is dead," the voice replied. "You're in my valley now. And you're trespassing." She gave them a moment to let the terror sink in, a moment to realize that there would be no escape. Then, she raised the sharps one last time. She centered the crosshairs on the chest of the first man, the one who had recognized her name. There was no more toying. The lesson was over. The payment was due. She fired. The man was thrown from his saddle and did not move. His two companions stared in abject terror at his body, then back at the silent, watching rocks. They were completely defenseless. One of them, the one who had been thrown from his horse, dropped to his knees and raised his hands in surrender. Rachel ejected the spent cartridge. She watched them for a long moment. She could have killed them both. But a dead man tells no tales. A terrified survivor, on the other hand, is a weapon. "Leave the horses," the voice commanded. "Walk east. Don't look back. Tell your colonel what happened here today. Tell him the ghost of Ash Hollow has a message for him. Tell him, I'm coming for the rest of you." The two men didn't need to be told twice. They scrambled over the rocks, stumbling and falling in their haste to get away. They fled on foot, two terrified men running from a ghost they had never even seen. Rachel stayed in her blind until they were long gone. She then made her way down into the canyon. She calmly collected the horses and the weapons. She did not look at the body of the man she had killed. He was not a person. He was a debt that had been paid, the first of many. The two survivors stumbled back to the Red Hand's main camp late that night. They were shoeless, their clothes torn, their faces scratched and bleeding from their frantic flight through the wilderness. They were babbling, half mad with terror, about a ghost, a voice from the rocks, and a rifle that sounded like the wrath of God. Colonel Thorne listened to their incoherent story with a cold, contemptuous fury. He was a man of logic and order. He did not believe in ghosts. He saw only a bungled patrol, a dead man, and two cowards trying to save their own skins. He had one of them flogged for deserting his post and the other pistol whipped for incompetence. But he could not ignore the facts. One of his men was dead, killed by a single, powerful rifle shot from an unseen assailant. Two more were disarmed with almost supernatural precision. And the patrol's horses and weapons were gone. This was not the work of some frightened farmer with a squirrel gun. This was the work of a professional. He sent a larger, more heavily armed patrol to the Box Canyon the next day. They found the body, the massive rock slide blocking the entrance, and the spent casings from the Outlaws' own pistols. But of the attacker, there was no sign. Not a footprint, not a track, not a single spent shell. It was as if the shots had come from the sky itself. The story of the Ash Hollow ghost began to circulate through the camp, no longer as the babbling of cowards, but as a chilling, whispered possibility. Rachel, meanwhile, had not been idle. The captured horses and weapons were a valuable prize. She led the animals to a hidden, high meadow pasture she knew from her childhood, a place her father had used to hide his own mounts. The weapons she cleaned and oiled, adding them to her growing arsenal in the root cellar. Her strategy was evolving. She knew direct confrontation was still foolish. Her greatest weapon was fear. She had to make the entire valley a place of menace for the Red Hand Brigade. She had to turn their own confidence against them, to make them afraid of every shadow, every rock, every whisper of the wind. Her next target was their supply line. A heavy wagon, escorted by 4 riders, made a weekly trip from the territory's eastern edge, bringing ammunition, whiskey, and other provisions to Thorne's camp. The route was predictable, following the only trail wide enough for a wagon through a dense, forested part of the hollow. Rachel spent 2 days scouting the route, her father's lessons on traps and ambushes running through her mind. She chose a spot where the trail narrowed, with a steep, wooded hillside on one side and a sharp drop to the creek on the other. She did not plan to kill them all. She planned to leave another message. Using the rope from her cache, she created a powerful snare, anchored to a heavy, bent sapling. The tripwire was thin and dark, nearly invisible against the forest floor. Further up the trail, she prepared her main attack. She felled a large pine tree, its trunk suspended precariously over the trail, held in place by a single, thick guide rope. On the day of the supply run, she was hidden on the hillside, overlooking the trail. She was not there to shoot. She was there to watch, and to cut one rope. The wagon rumbled into view, the four outriders moving with a new caution, their heads constantly scanning the trees. But they were looking for a man with a rifle. They were not looking at the ground beneath their horses' feet. The lead rider hit the tripwire. The bent sapling, released from its tension, snapped upright with incredible force. The snare pulled the rider clean out of his saddle, hoisting him upside down, dangling and screaming, 10 feet in the air. The sudden, bizarre attack threw the entire convoy into chaos. The other riders reined in hard, their horses panicking. The wagon driver fought to control his team. They drew their weapons, firing blindly into the forest. At that moment, from her hiding place, Rachel sliced through the guide rope with her father's razor-sharp skinning knife. The massive pine tree, freed from its restraint, crashed down onto the trail with a sound like a thunderclap, landing directly in front of the wagon team. It blocked the trail completely, a solid, immovable barrier. The convoy was now trapped. Their lead rider was still screaming, tangled in the snare. Their path forward was blocked. The forester on them was silent, watchful, and filled with an unseen menace. This time, there was no voice from the rocks. There was only their nerving, absolute silence. The 3 remaining outriders, their nerve completely broken, did the only thing they could think of. They abandoned the wagon, abandoned their screaming comrade, and fled, spurring their horses back the way they had come. Rachel waited until they were long gone. She made her way down to the trail. The man in the snare had stopped screaming and was now pleading and crying. She ignored him. She went to the supply wagon. She took what she needed, several boxes of ammunition and a case of medical supplies. The barrels of whiskey she smashed with an axe, letting the contents gurgle into the thirsty dirt. As a final touch, she used her knife to carve a single, stylized letter R into the side of a crate. Then, and only then, did she cut the man down. He fell to the ground in a heap, bruised and terrified. "Go back to your colonel," she said, her voice a low, cold whisper. She was no longer a disembodied voice. She was a physical presence, a woman in buckskins with eyes that held no pity, emerging from the shadows. "Tell him Rachel Miles sends her regards. Tell him this is my valley, and I am taking it back." She vanished back into the woods, leaving the man to entangle himself and flee. When Colonel Thorne heard this new story, his rage was incandescent. The ghost had a name. It was the widow, the woman whose farm he had burned. The idea was so preposterous, so insulting, that he almost refused to believe it. But the evidence was undeniable. His supply line was cut, his men were deserting in droves, and the whisper of the Ash Hollow ghost had now become a scream. The fear in his camp was no longer a possibility, it was a contagion. And he, the great military strategist, was being hunted, haunted, and dismantled by one woman. His obsession with finding and killing Rachel Miles now became the single, burning focus of his existence. Colonel Thorne was a man who prided himself on his rational, military mind. He did not believe in ghosts, but he did believe in fear as a weapon. And this woman, this Rachel Miles, was using it against him with a skill that was both infuriating and, on some cold, professional level, admirable. He realized he was not fighting a simple farmer. He was fighting a guerrilla, a shadow warrior who knew the terrain and was using his own numbers and arrogance against him. He changed his tactics. The large, predictable patrols were suspended. He pulled all his men back to the main camp, a fortified position near the ruins of an old mission. He turned his camp into a fortress and sent out small, elite squads of his best trackers, not to patrol, but to hunt. Their sole mission, to find and kill the widow. The valley became a chessboard. Rachel, from her high country sanctuaries, watched as the hunters became the hunted. She saw the small, skilled teams moving through the forest, their movements cautious and professional. She knew a direct ambush against these men would be far more dangerous. They were alert, they were skilled, and they were looking for her. She had to become a ghost again. She had to hit a target that would not only hurt them logistically, but would shatter the morale of these elite hunters. She needed to kill one of their leaders. Her target was Thorne's second-in-command, a brutal, efficient killer named Captain Marcus Cole. Cole was Thorne's right hand, a former army scout with a reputation for sadism and a near-supernatural ability to track. He was the leader of the hunt. Taking him out would be like cutting the head off the snake's most venomous viper. Cole was clever. He never slept in the same place twice. His movements were erratic. But Rachel had an advantage he couldn't account for, a lifetime spent learning this land not as a soldier, but as a naturalist. She knew the hidden game trails, the secret springs, the places an animal or a man trying to live off the land would have to go. For 3 days, she tracked the trackers. She became a shadow of a shadow, moving silently on the periphery of their hunt, always downwind, always using the terrain to mask her presence. She ate cold rations, slept in short, watchful bursts, and felt the old, familiar instincts of the hunt her father had taught her awaken fully. This was not just about vengeance anymore. This was a contest of skill, a deadly game of survival. She finally found her opportunity. Cole and his squad of 4 men made a temporary camp on a rocky promontory overlooking Clear Creek. It was a good defensive position, with a clear view of the surrounding area. But it had one critical flaw. To get water, they had to descend a narrow, winding game trail to the creek below. Rachel watched them for a full day, studying their routine. They were disciplined. They sent 2 men at a time for water, while the others stood guard. A direct sniper attack was risky. The others would be on her position in minutes. She needed to isolate Cole. That night, under the light of a full, bright moon, a hunter's moonch made her move. She did not approach their camp. She went down to the creek, to the spot where the game trail ended. She carried with her one of the captured pistols and the garrote from her father's cache. She found a spot in a thicket of willows just yards from the water's edge. She waited. The air was cold, the only sounds the gurgle of the creek and the chirping of crickets. Hours passed. She was as patient as a stone. Just before dawn, the time when a man's senses are at their dullest, she heard them. 2 men, moving quietly down the trail. Through the leaves, she saw them. It was Captain Cole and one of his men. They had come for the morning's water themselves. She let them reach the water's edge. She let them fill their canteens. As they turned to go, she acted. She did not use a gun. A gunshot would alert the camp. She rose from the willows like a phantom, silent and sudden. The man with Cole had no time to react. Her arm snaked around his throat, the garrote wire biting deep. His cry was a strangled gurgle. His hands clawed at the wire, but it was useless. He went limp in seconds. Cole spun around, his pistol already in his hand, his reactions incredibly fast. But Rachel was already moving. She dropped the dead man and threw herself to the side, into the shallow water of the creek. Just as Cole's pistol roared, the bullet kicking up a spray of water where she had been. She landed on her side in the icy water, the captured Colt already in her hand. Cole fired again, the muzzle flash a brilliant, blinding orange in the pre-dawn gloom. The shot went wide. Rachel fired back. Her shot was not wild. It struck Cole in the thigh, shattering the bone. He screamed, "Ugh!" animal sound of pain and rage, and collapsed at the water's edge. The fight was over in less than 10 seconds. Rachel got to her feet, soaked and freezing, the pistol steady in her hand. She walked towards Cole, who was writhing in agony, clutching his ruined leg. He looked up at her, his face a mask of disbelief and hatred. "You?" he gasped, the single word a curse. "Me?" she replied, her voice as cold as the creek water. She could have killed him then. But his death was not the primary goal. His capture was. He was the colonel's right hand. He held Thorne's plans, his strategies, his secrets, in his head. She disarmed him, her movements efficient and impersonal. She used his own belt to create a crude tourniquet for his leg, not out of mercy, but to keep him from bleeding out before she could get what she wanted. The shots had been heard at the camp above. She could hear shouting, the sounds of the other 3 men scrambling down the trail. She had no time. She looked at Cole, his eyes blazing with defiance even in his pain. "Your choice, Captain," she said, her voice low. "You can tell your men to stand down, or I can put a bullet in your other leg. And then your arm. I have time for at least one more before they get here." Cole stared at her, at the absolute lack of doubt in her eyes. He knew she meant it. He was a pragmatist. A live prisoner was better than a dead hero. "Hold your fire," he roared, his voice echoing up the game trail. "It's a trap. Hold your position." The men hesitated, their loyalty to their commander at war with their survival instincts. That hesitation was all Rachel needed. She hauled the heavy, wounded captain to his feet, using his own body as a shield, and began to drag him away down the creek, into the labyrinth of rocks and shadows, vanishing just as the sun began to crest the eastern mountains. The ghost had not only killed one of their own, she had captured their leader, right from under their noses. The hunter's moon had set, and the hunter had become the prize. The capture of Captain Cole was a masterstroke, a blow from which the Red Hand Brigade's morale would never recover. It was one thing to lose men to a phantom sniper, it was another to have their best tracker, their most feared leader, snatched from under their noses. The 3 remaining men of Cole's elite squad returned to the main camp with a story of such audacious, terrifying skill that it solidified Rachel's legend. She was no longer just a ghost, she was a demon, a supernatural force that could walk through their lines and take whomever she pleased. Rachel dragged her prisoner deep into the rugged hill country, to a place she knew no one would find them, in old, abandoned bear den she had discovered as a child. It was a dark, dry cave, its entrance concealed by a thick curtain of ancient ivy. It was here that the interrogation began. It was not an interrogation of torture. Rachel had seen her father use pain, and she knew it often yielded lies. Her method was more subtle, and far more cruel. She tended to Cole's wound, cleaning it and bandaging it tightly, keeping the infection at bay. She gave him water and a small portion of her own rations. And then she left him, tethered by a secure rope, in the absolute, suffocating darkness of the cave, for 2 days. She deprived him of light, of sound, of all human contact. She let his own mind, his own fear, and the gnawing pain in his leg become his torturers. When she finally returned, lighting a single candle, he was a different man. His arrogance was gone, replaced by a raw, desperate fear. He was a soldier, a killer, but he was not prepared for this kind of psychological warfare. Thorne's plan, she said, her voice a quiet, calm demand in the flickering darkness. Everything. He broke. He told her everything. He told her about Thorne's grand ambition, not just to control the valley, but to use it as a fortified, independent barony, a staging ground to launch a war against the territory's legitimate government. He told her about the large payroll, a chest of gold coins, that Thorne used to keep his men loyal. He described the camp's layout, the guard rotations, the number of men, barely 20, their morale shattered. And he told her the most critical piece of information: Thorne, paranoid and furious, was planning a final, desperate act. He was going to ride on the town of Haven itself, not to occupy it, but to burn it to the ground, to slaughter its inhabitants as a final, brutal message to the territory, and to the ghost who had defied him. The attack was planned for 3 days' time, during the festival of the harvest moon. Rachel listened, her face an unreadable mask. When he was done, she gave him more water and a piece of dried meat. She left him in the darkness once more. She now had the keys to the kingdom, the blueprint of her enemy's mind. And she knew that the final battle could not be fought by her alone. She had started this war, but the town of Ash Hollow would have to finish it. Leaving Cole securely tied, she made her way to Haven under the cover of night. She did not go into the town. She went to the farm of a man named Jedediah Smith, the grizzled, respected elder of the town council. She found him in his barn, sharpening a scythe by lantern light. When she emerged from the shadows, her face grim, the Colts on her hips, he did not cry out. He simply stopped his work and looked at her, his eyes full of a weary awe. "The whole valley's been wondering when we'd see you," he said. "Thorne is coming," she said, without preamble. "In 3 days. He's coming to burn the town and kill everyone in it." She told him what she had learned from Cole. She laid out Thorne's plan, his numbers, his objective. The old man listened, his face growing grimmer with every word. "We have no militia to speak of," he said when she had finished. "A few dozen men with hunting rifles against 20 trained killers." "You have more than that," Rachel said, her voice a low, intense command. "You have this valley. You have a reason to fight. And you have me." She laid out her own plan, a desperate, audacious strategy that was not about defense, but about a full-scale, coordinated attack. "You will not wait for him in the town," she said. "That's a trap. You will empty the town. Every man, every woman, every child. You will make it a ghost town. And then, you will turn the town itself into a weapon." For the next hour, she spoke, her voice never rising, but filled with an authority that was absolute. She described how to build barricades, not to stop the enemy, but to channel them. She explained how to set fires, not for destruction, but to create walls of smoke and flame that would confuse and disorient them. She told them where to place their best riflemen, how to create crossfires, how to use the element of surprise. She was asking a town of farmers to become an army of guerrilla fighters. When she was done, Jedediah looked at her, his old eyes seeing not just the fearsome legend, but the brilliant, desperate strategist. "They'll follow you," he said, "after what you've done. They'll follow you to the gates of hell itself." "I'm not asking them to follow me," Rachel replied. "I'm asking them to fight for themselves. I will be there. I will be the spark. They must become the inferno." She left him with the plan and a final, grim instruction on what to do with Captain Cole. Then she melted back into the night, returning to the high country to prepare for the final act. The unraveling was complete. The stage was set for the final confrontation. The day of the harvest moon arrived cloaked in a tense and natural quiet. The town of Haven was empty, eerily so. No smoke rose from the chimneys, no children played in the street, no sound came from the blacksmith's forge. Doors were closed, windows were shuttered. It was a ghost town, a silent, waiting trap. The entire population of Ash Hollow, following Rachel's instructions, had evacuated to a series of hidden, defensible caves in the hills overlooking the town. They had taken their livestock, their provisions, and most importantly, their weapons. Left behind was a small, determined force of 50 of the town's best shots, hidden in pre-selected positions in attics, on rooftops, in cellars with specially prepared loopholes. They were farmers, not soldiers, but their faces were set with a grim, unified resolve. They were no longer sheep waiting for the slaughter. Rachel was not with them. Her place was in the heart of the fire she was about to create. She had chosen her own position, the belfry of the town's small stone church, the only building that offered a commanding, 360-degree view of the entire town square. With her were the Sharps rifle, the sawed-off shotgun, her twin Colts, and enough ammunition to fight a small war. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in fiery streaks of orange and purple, they came. Colonel Thorne and his remaining 20 men rode into the valley, not as a disciplined cavalry unit, but as a pack of rabid dogs. Their earlier defeats had stripped away their military pretense, leaving only a raw, brutal desire for destruction. They rode into the empty town with a sense of unease. The silence was unnerving. Thorne, his face a mask of paranoid fury, scanned the closed doors and empty windows. "They've run," he sneered to his men, his voice a little too loud in the quiet. "The cowards have run. Find the whiskey. We'll give them a bonfire they can see from the next territory." His men, their spirits buoyed by the lack of resistance, dismounted and began their work of destruction. They smashed in the door of the saloon, their whoops and hollers echoing in the empty street. They began to splash lamp oil on the walls of the general store and the sheriff's office. From her perch in the belfry, Rachel watched. She waited. She let them commit. She let them get comfortable in their work of destruction. The plan required precise timing. When half of Thorne's men were inside the saloon, drinking and smashing bottles, and the other half were preparing their torches, Rachel gave the signal. She did not fire a gun. She rang the church bell. A single deep, resonant bond echoed through the valley. It was not a call to prayer. It was a call to war. Before the sound had even faded, the town erupted. From 50 hidden positions, the townsmen opened fire. It was not a ragged volley. It was a disciplined, coordinated crossfire, just as Rachel had planned. The outlaws in the street were caught completely by surprise, cut down in a hail of lead. The men preparing the torches fell where they stood, their unlit instruments of destruction clattering on the ground. The men in the saloon, drunk and disoriented, poured out into the street, firing wildly. They were met with a second, devastating volley. The town square became a charnel house. Colonel Thorne, who had been on his horse directing the arson, was a man transformed by pure rage. His plan was in ruins. His men were being slaughtered. He roared orders, trying to rally the survivors, but his commands were lost in the cacophony of gunfire. At that moment, the second part of Rachel's plan went into effect. The town's women and older children, hidden safely in the hills, lit the signal fires that had been prepared. Not in the town, but in the dry grasslands at the valley's entrance, the only escape route. A huge, roaring wall of flame erupted, sealing the valley. The inferno had begun. Thorn, seeing the flames behind him and the slaughter in front of him, knew he was trapped. He looked up and finally saw her, a lone figure in the belfry, the setting sun glinting off a long rifle barrel. The ghost, the architect of his destruction. The church, he screamed, his voice raw with hatred. Kill her! Kill the witch! The few remaining outlaws, perhaps 5 or 6 of them, now had a single focus. They ignored the fire from the townspeople and charged the church, a final, suicidal assault on the woman who had brought them to ruin. This was the moment Rachel had been waiting for. This was her fight. As they charged, she opened up with the sharps. The powerful rifle boomed, its heavy slugs punching through the charging men, each shot a final, definitive statement. One went down, then another. They reached the heavy oak doors of the church and began to smash their way in. Rachel dropped the sharps, picked up the shotgun, and descended the rickety ladder from the belfry just as the doors burst inward. The scene inside the church was a hellish tableau of smoke, shadows, and muzzle flashes. She met them with both barrels of the shotgun, the blast tearing through the first man to enter. She dropped the empty weapon, and the twin Colts seemed to leap into her hands. The church became a shooting gallery, the roar of the pistols deafening in the confined space. She was a whirlwind of controlled violence, a firestorm in human form. She fought her way out of the church, back into the burning, smoke-filled street. Only one man was left. Colonel Thorn. He stood by his horse, his elegant uniform in tatters, a saber in one hand and a pistol in the other. He was a madman, a cornered rat, his eyes burning with a hateful fire that rivaled the flames around them. He and Rachel faced each other in the middle of the inferno, the last two combatants in a war that had consumed the valley. The world had devolved into a primal chaos of smoke, flame, and the screams of the dying. The town of Haven was an inferno, but it was a controlled, weaponized inferno, its flames channeling the battle, its smoke a shroud for the defenders. Colonel Thorn and Rachel Miles stood 30 yards apart in the town square, two figures silhouetted against the raging fires, the commanders of two armies now reduced to a final, personal duel. Thorn's face, illuminated by the flickering firelight, was a mask of utter madness. Everything he had built, everything he had conquered, had been brought to ruin by this one impossible woman. His dreams of a personal kingdom had turned to ash in his mouth. "You," he roared, his voice cracking, spittle flying from his lips. "You are the ghost that has haunted me. I am the widow of a man you allowed to be murdered." Rachel's voice was low, clear, and cut through the roar of the flames. She held a Colt in each hand, their ivory grips stark against her soot-stained skin. "I am the fire you started, and I am here to finish it." Thorn laughed, a high, unhinged sound. He raised his pistol. "The devil take you, woman." The duel was not a classic Western standoff. It was a brutal, desperate exchange. Thorn fired first, his shot wild with rage. Rachel did not stand still. She dove to the side, landing on one knee behind an overturned water trough, the colonel's bullet splintering the wood where her head had been. She came up firing, not a single, aimed shot, but a volley. Both Colts bucked in her hands, laying down a suppressing fire that forced Thorn to seek cover behind a dead horse. Lead tore through the air, a deadly, invisible hornet's nest between them. The remaining townsmen, their primary targets eliminated, held their fire. This was no longer their fight. This was a reckoning, a personal affair being settled in the heart of the town they had reclaimed. Thorn, the trained cavalry officer, was not just a gunman. He was a tactician, even in his madness. He knew he was outmatched in a straight pistol fight. He needed to close the distance, to use his saber. Under the cover of the thick, billowing smoke from the burning general store, he made his move. He broke from cover, not running at her, but circling, using the chaos as his ally. Rachel lost sight of him. The smoke was a blinding, choking curtain. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She knew he was in there, a predator stalking her. She holstered one Colt, drawing the long, heavy skinning knife from her belt. If he wanted a close fight, she would give him one. She heard a sound to her left, the scrape of a boot on stone. She spun, firing into the smoke. A cry of pain, but not a fatal one. Thorn stumbled out of the smoke cloud, his left arm bleeding, but he was still coming, the saber held high, his eyes burning with a murderous light. He was on her before she could fire again. The saber whistled down, a shining arc of death. She threw herself backwards, the tip of the blade slicing through the buckskin on her shoulder, drawing blood. She landed hard, the wind knocked out of her. Thorn stood over her, his face a triumphant, demonic mask. "The fire claims you," he screamed, raising the saber for a final, killing blow. She had no time to aim, no time to think. From the ground, she fired the Colt, the muzzle flash illuminating his face in a grotesque, instantaneous portrait of shock. The bullet struck him low, in the gut, a mortal but not instantly fatal wound. He staggered back, the saber falling from his nerveless fingers. He looked down at the dark, spreading stain on his tunic, his expression one of utter disbelief. He had lost. He sank to his knees, his eyes still fixed on her. What are you?" he whispered, his voice a choked rattle. Rachel got to her feet, her body aching, her shoulder on fire. She walked towards him, the Colt still leveled at his head. She stood over the man who had destroyed her life, who had brought war to her peaceful valley. She looked into his dying eyes. "I am the widow from Ash Hollow," she said, her voice quiet, but carrying the weight of all she had lost, and all she had become. "And this is my land." She did not fire again. She simply stood there and watched as the light faded from his eyes, as the architect of so much pain and destruction slumped forward into the dust of the town he had failed to conquer. The fire had claimed him, just as he had predicted, but it was a fire of his own making. As the last of Colonel Thorne's mercenaries were either killed or captured by the townsmen, a new sound began to compete with the crackle of the flames, the ringing of the church bell. This time, it was not a signal of war, but a call for a different kind of army. The women, children, and old men descended from the hills, their faces grim but determined, carrying buckets, shovels, and wet blankets. The battle for Haven was over. The battle for Haven had just begun. Rachel, her shoulder bandaged by the town's doctor, worked alongside them. She was no longer a lone avenger, but a part of the community, her movements mirroring those of the people around her. They formed a bucket brigade from Clear Creek, their shared purpose a silent, powerful bond that was stronger than any fear. The fire, which had been their weapon, was now their common enemy. They fought the flames all night, their faces smeared with soot, their bodies pushed to the limits of exhaustion. They worked in a strange, almost reverent silence, the only sounds the shouting of commands and the hiss of water on hot embers. In the ashes of their old lives, they were forging a new community, one baptized in fire and cemented by courage. When the first, pale light of dawn crept over the Black Spur Mountains, the town of Haven was still standing. It was a ruin, a blackened, smoking skeleton of what it had once been. But it was their ruin. They had not just saved their town, they had earned it. Rachel stood in the town square, now a landscape of debris and ash, and watched the sunrise. Jedediah Smith, the old councilman, came and stood beside her. His face was a mask of weariness, but his eyes held a light she had never seen before. "We owe you everything, Rachel," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You owe yourselves," she replied, her gaze fixed on the rising sun. "I was just the spark. You were the fire." He nodded, understanding. "What will you do now?" "The town. We'd be honored to help you rebuild your farm. Or a house here, in town. You have a place here. You are the heart of this place now." Rachel looked at the faces of the people around her. They were no longer looking at her with pity, but with a deep, abiding respect. They didn't see poor Rachel, the weak widow. They saw the woman who had faced down an army, the woman who had walked through fire and emerged stronger. She thought of her father, of his lessons on being a wolf. She had been a wolf. She had hunted, and she had killed. But as she looked at the community coming together, at a neighbor helping another shore up a collapsing wall, at a woman sharing the last of her water with a stranger, she realized her father had been wrong about one thing. The world was full of wolves, yes, but it was also full of shepherds. And she, in the strangest, most violent of ways, had become one. "I think," she said, a slow, tired smile touching her lips for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, "I'll rebuild. Right here." She gestured not towards her old farm, but towards the center of the town. But not alone. The rebuilding of Haven became a legend in the territory. It was a story of a town that had been burned to the ground and had risen from its own ashes, stronger and more united than before. They did not rebuild the old haven. They built a new one, a town forged in the image of its own resilience. And at its heart was Rachel Miles. She was no longer a ghost, no longer a lone avenger. She became a leader, a counselor, a protector. The skills her father had taught her for survival and killing, she now used to build and protect. She taught the town's young people how to track, how to hunt, and yes, how to shoot not for vengeance, but for defense, so that they would never be helpless again. She never married again. Her heart, in many ways, was buried with David on that small, peaceful farm. But her life was full. She had found a new family, a new purpose, in the town she had saved. The fire of her rage had burned itself out, leaving behind not cold embers, but a warm, steady, and unquenchable flame of a leader, a survivor, a founder. Years passed. The story of the burning of Haven and the rise of Rachel Miles became a cornerstone of frontier lore, a tale told around campfires and in dusty saloons, growing grander with each telling. They called her the Flame of Ash Hollow, a woman whose righteous fury had cleansed the valley of its demons. The town of Haven itself became a beacon of a different kind. It was known as a place of refuge, a community that looked after its own, a town that had faced the worst the West could throw at it, and had not only survived, but thrived. The blackened timbers of the old buildings were replaced by sturdy stone and fresh-cut pine. A new, proper sheriff's office was built, and a schoolhouse, and the church was restored, its bell ringing out every Sunday, a sound of peace and endurance. Rachel remained at the center of it all. The lines of grief on her face softened over the years, replaced by the quiet confidence of a respected leader. She never held a formal title, but her word was law, her wisdom sought by all. The twin Colts were cleaned and put away, a relic of a past she had no need for anymore. The valley was safe. One cool autumn evening, as Rachel sat on the porch of the small house the town had built for her, a young, eager journalist from the East arrived. Having traveled for weeks to hear her story firsthand, he was full of questions about the Ash Hollow ghost, about her battles, her vengeance. Rachel listened patiently, then looked out at the peaceful valley, bathed in the soft, golden light of the setting sun. "You've come to hear a story about a ghost," she said, her voice calm and steady. "But the ghost died a long time ago. The story of this valley isn't about vengeance. It's about what comes after. It's about rebuilding. It's about ordinary people who, when their world was turned to ash, found a way to grow something new." She had found peace, not by forgetting the fire, but by learning to control it, to use its heat to forge something better and stronger than what had come before. She was no longer the daughter of a bounty hunter, nor the wife of a farmer. She was Rachel of Ash Hollow, a woman who had walked through the inferno and had taught a valley, and all who heard her story, that the most powerful flame is not the one that destroys, but the one that lights the way home. And so we leave the story of Rachel Miles, a testament to the fire that sleeps in the heart of the quietest souls, waiting for the right spark to set it free. A reminder that even in the harshest of lands, true strength is not about the wars you fight, but about the homes you build, and the dawns you live to see.